Prime Minister Andy Burnham. What difference is he going to make to all of us since we now accept that that is a reality?
I mean, look, he is barring some outrageous scandal that none of us can think of.
Yeah,
Probably he's not Prime Minister yet.
He's not Prime Minister, but in a matter of weeks, I find it slightly weird and occasionally slightly absurd that this man is being viewed by large sections of the Labour Party as a kind of messiah. He's been around for decades, perfectly good politician, but I find that slightly bizarre. But
just on that, I do think my sister captured it best of all the people I've spoken to. She said, man goes down the pub, buys a round of drinks, wakes up as Prime Minister, which is broadly, I think, what's happened.
Okay, that's fair enough. Most people in Britain have always been, on occasions like this, fairly fair-minded. So whatever their reservations might be, I think they'll be in a mood of, all right, well, let's give him his chance. And therefore, I think the key question is, what difference is he going to make? Now, we've obviously both of us have been following his policy platform on the campaign trail, such as it's been over the last few months. Let's start with the economy and his key appointment as Chancellor. I always thought the idea that Rachel Reeves was going to stay on was absolutely absurd, and that's clearly not going to happen. There's a lot of discussion about whether it's Wes Streeting, Ed Miliband, or someone else. I kind of get the argument for Wes Streeting, but I find it very hard to believe, really, that makes sense for him, which I guess does leave us with Ed Miliband. But before we get on to the policies that they might go for and how that might impact everyone watching or listening to this, what do you think of the personnel choice?
I mean, I genuinely don't know. I do know that Ed Miliband would very much like to be Chancellor. I do know that Andy Burnham recognises that it is helpful to have somebody at the Treasury who knows the Treasury, understands how officials work, and therefore is less likely to be manipulated by those officials in the way that I do think, to an extent, Rachel Reeves was. I don't believe a more savvy Chancellor who actually understands Treasury psychology and Treasury history would have abolished the universal entitlement to the winter fuel credit, which was, certainly the first very bad mistake this government made, and still ranks as one of its worst mistakes. I mean, when you talk to MPs, voters still bring it up as a reason they don't like Starmer and Reeves. This was something that the Treasury had wanted to do forever. Previous chancellors had basically told officials to hop off. She got sort of conned into it. And, Andy Burnham needs to have somebody there who can sort of see through Treasury ruses. Treasury just hated it. They just thought it was economically pointless, which to an extent it is. But the politics of removing it were always going to be horrendous. And, the politics on this occasion, given that it didn't save very much money, should have outweighed the economics. Anyway, but that doesn't mean it has to be Ed. Ed obviously was in Gordon Brown's team as the special advisor for years. He does know the Treasury inside out. It was quite interesting. The former permanent undersecretary at the Treasury, Nick Macpherson, now Lord Macpherson, who you might have thought, given he's definitely not a sort of Labour lefty, might have been wary of Ed Miliband, has actually been saying some quite positive things about Ed Miliband, and that may indeed, given that Macpherson is definitely not a sort of wacky character, that might give Burnham confidence to appoint Miliband, against the counter argument that some put that Miliband will somehow drive a coach and horses through borrowing restraints and spook the city. I mean, it seems to me what's quite important, when it comes to people saying, oh, well, if Ed Miliband is Chancellor, it's obviously going to be a disaster because people aren't going to lend to the UK, or if Burnham nationalises water or some other industry, it'll be a disaster. Bear in mind that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer sustained themselves in office for perhaps longer than Labour MPs would have wanted, because they ran this line that if they went at that point, lenders to the UK would more or less go on strike. Interest rates would go through the roof, and it would be a complete catastrophe for the UK. Well, the person they thought was going to be a disaster, who has flip-flopped when it comes to talking about, what he'll do with borrowing and tax, is a shoo-in. And there hasn't been a meltdown in markets. And I think it's important to point out that actually, although it would be really helpful to get the borrowing costs of the UK down, at the moment, markets are plainly giving Burnham the benefit of the doubt. And it shows, I would argue, I always thought it was scaremongering, and I think that's what it was. I have to say, I think there is quite a strong argument, though, that if you're looking for somebody who knows the Treasury, somebody else who knows the Treasury terribly well is, of course, Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary. She was Chief Secretary of the Treasury for quite a long time. She's also related to somebody else who knows the Treasury.
Who knows the Treasury very well.
Quite well. Anyway,
Yeah.
I think there's my understanding is Yvette Cooper wants to remain Foreign Secretary. And I'm also pretty sure that Andy Burnham hasn't made a definitive decision about who it will be. But, there is an argument for saying that if you want somebody who knows the Treasury is not going to be bossed around by them, Yvette Cooper would be a very credible choice. And actually, in some ways, maybe a more market-friendly choice. And then, of course, there is Wes Streeting, who came out recently and said, despite what people may think, there is not a cigarette paper, to use that cliche, between me and Andy Burnham on anything important.
Do you think his brazen disloyalty his overweening ambition and brazen disloyalty? I mean, if you're Andy Burnham, is that really what you want in your Chancellor? I find that hard to credit, honestly, as an idea.
Well, all I would say is, as I mentioned on my show the other night, lots of friends of Wes Streeting think he would make a very good choice.
Well, I bet they do.
But it also significantly, he has given one big and important speech in the last few days.
Yeah.
And it's all about the economy.
Yeah,
it's all about, it is absolutely
Okay.
But I, like you, think, if I had to take a punt on it, I would probably say it'll be Ed Miliband. But it might be Yvette. It might be.
Sidebar, if he chooses Ed, and I sort of agree with you, I think it's Ed or Yvette, does he leave Yvette as Foreign Secretary?
I think so. I mean, so I was at I was going to try and dignify this as something that it wasn't. So I was going to say a meeting of Foreign Office people, but it was a party, and there were a lot of drunk Foreign Office people there. And one of the things...
You're allowed to go to parties, Robert. Right.
And one of the things that was quite striking, these were, a lot of sort of past and present Foreign Office people, and all they wanted to talk about was none of them had a clue what Andy Burnham's sort of view of the world is. I mean, the truth is, he never has worked in the sort of foreign affairs, foreign policy, defence area. And, one of the things he's going to have to do, I think, in the next few weeks is set out some kind of vision of all of that. But and given that this is not his area of expertise, they were all saying two things. One is he ought to beg Jonathan Powell to stay on as the National Security Advisor, because
he would.
So my understanding was that Jonathan Powell had indicated initially that he would do the job for 2 years, and that would mean he would leave in a few months. I just don't really know whether he would feel it was sort of in the public interest, national duty kind of thing to stay on for a bit. Certainly if I were Burnham, because I do think John Powell has done a very good job, actually. He's got his own contacts, which he's exploited rather effectively on behalf of Britain. He does have a sophisticated understanding of how foreign policy works. So if I were Andy Burnham, I would definitely ask him to stay on. I mean, we might come on to this later, but given that it looks as though James Purnell, former cabinet minister in the Blair government, will be Andy Burnham's chief of staff. They are very old mates, Purnell and Burnham. And, I possess a very amusing picture of the two of them in black tie suits after playing football in the same football team on a football tour when they were both much younger.
I played football against both of them in the lobby team back in the day.
They are mates. So
both quite good footballers, to be fair.
And I may be wrong about this, but I think Purnell and Powell get on all right. So that might persuade Jonathan to stay on.
So a bit of continuity is.
And I think there's also therefore a chance that he will take the view that Yvette should also stay on. I think from what I can see, she's doing a pretty effective job.
I guess the key question people want answered is what is going to change. So let's just look at that for a moment. Andy Burnham at one stage caused quite a lot of raised eyebrows when he's effectively said that government shouldn't be in hock to the bond markets. He then rode that back, said he would respect the fiscal rules, obviously the key ones, that by the end of this parliament will have balanced the current account and will have debt falling as a percentage of GDP. Now, he's also made some quite interesting sort of policy suggestions. He's talked about he's not liking the increase on employers' national insurance. He's talked about raising the personal allowance, which would give an immediate boost to people on low incomes. He's talked about reforming council tax and potentially going to a land tax. I put that in the very long grass category because, as we've discussed before, you want to reform council tax, you've got to do a revaluation, and that's the work of years, but possibly something that they might start. I guess what I wanted to sort of put to you and what I'm really interested to have your views on are, he's got some quite good ideas, but they cost money. He said he's going to respect the manifesto promises not to increase taxes. So he's saying basically
not all taxes.
Not all taxes.
just VAT.
Yeah, the ones
income tax.
Yeah, as promised in the manifesto. So here we are. He's coming in. He wants to do some things differently. He's got some ideas. No one really thinks they're bad ideas, but they do cost money. He said he's going to observe the fiscal rules. So I guess I'm interested to really get your sense of which of these ideas are implementable. What's your feeling about his room for maneuver and what he's actually likely to do?
So he doesn't have an enormous room for maneuver. One is because when it comes to taxation, the biggest sums that you can raise are from the big taxes, the ones that Labour's manifesto says he can't raise, and he has indicated, as you say, that he won't break the manifesto. One of the things that he has signalled he would like to do, and this could happen relatively quickly, would be to go back to what Nigel Lawson did, which was to equalise the rates of capital gains tax and income tax, which is a way of getting a bit more money from the wealthies, because one of the techniques that wealthier people do is to convert income into capital, and that gets you a much lower tax rate.
Sorry to interrupt, but doesn't that really off an already quite off business community?
It depends how you do it. You can do it so long as you give tax breaks. Make sure that the tax breaks to genuine wealth creators, entrepreneurs, people starting new businesses are generous, and you might need to increase the generosity for those who are creating the exciting businesses of the future. But the more important thing is you have to couple any streamlining of capital gains and income tax with arrangements that make sure that you are not taxed on the element of the increase in the value of your assets, your business, that are simply due to inflation. Right? The rate that you eventually pay goes up, but you are, in a sense, protected in terms of the real value of your investment. And, if you were to do that, I think most people think that would be a sensible, well, not most, but many people, even on the right, think that's a perfectly okay reform. The problem, however, is it doesn't raise that much money. I mean, it's the sort of thing that if you want to prove to the world that you are taking a bit more from the wealthiest, it's symbolically quite good, and it raises a few billion, but it does not raise the sums of money that would transform his ability to increase significant amounts of investment in anything, frankly, from infrastructure through to whatever else he may want to do.
What will really be the attitude to the fiscal rules? And is there any leeway that you see? Jim O'Neill's, for example, talked about drastically increasing the amount we spend on investing in infrastructure and so on.
I think it is possible. I was slightly surprised. The rule that is all about the absolute level of debt, right? So there are two rules. One is about making sure you don't fund day-to-day spending from borrowing over the medium term. But then there's another rule which says that there's a new definition of debt that the Chancellor, still the current Chancellor Rachel Reeves, introduced, which said, I think the timetable is 3 years. It has to be falling. I think it's 3 years from now.
Yeah.
But what she did was she allowed certain kinds of asset to be netted off the debt level. I thought that they would do some creative accounting that would convert some infrastructure investment into the kind of financial assets that could also be netted off that debt figure, which the simple way of explaining this is to say that it would allow more infrastructure investment. She didn't do that. Maybe Andy Burnham could do that. That doesn't mean to say, though, that he can borrow to do whatever he likes. And the reason he can't borrow to do whatever he likes is, in the end, the fiscal rules are only part of what investors look at. Even if, let's just say, he borrows some colossal sum and then does some creative accounting and it doesn't increase, it doesn't break the fiscal rule. Nonetheless, that colossal amount of borrowing still has to come from lenders to the UK. And they'll know that it's coming from them, and they'll look at it and they'll just say, well, we're only really prepared to lend this if we honestly believe that the project or projects it is funding are going to make the UK more productive and grow faster. Now, if he can demonstrate that what he's doing will increase the growth rate of the economy and therefore lead to higher tax revenues, maybe international investors will lend him more money than they would lend Rachel Reeves, because the big argument, some would say the big failure of this government is it didn't get the growth rate up, right? But equally, those investors may look at whatever Andy Burnham wants to do and say this is a vanity project that is highly unlikely to do anything significant to the prospects for the UK. And all that'll happen is they may lend the money, but at much higher interest rates. And the problem we've currently got at the moment, which is we're paying far too much interest, will get worse. So he can't do what he likes, although the fiscal rules are not as constraining as perhaps some may believe.
If Tony Blair was walking into Downing Street as head of this new administration, there's some things I think, I don't know whether you agree, that he would fairly obviously do. I mean, I think Kemi Badenoch would do the same things, and there's a fair few people in the Labour Party who might be prepared to consider it, but also an awful lot who won't and wouldn't. So what I mean by a Blair leadership would probably involve increasing defence spending and possibly funding it by cutting quite significantly the welfare bills. And Tony Blair's been on the record as saying, we just can't keep the welfare bill rising at this level. He also is on the record as saying he doesn't think and I'm pretty sure he did say the triple lock is not sustainable either. There's a lot of discussion about those huge, costly commitments that the government has, the size of the welfare bill and the triple lock. Does he do anything like that? Does he? I mean, I think of Burnham as fairly centrist and a bit soft left rather than anything else. Does he contemplate something like that? Can he get that through the party?
So there are lots of early decisions he's got to take in all these areas. So one of the things that the Prime Minister Starmer has said, and signalled through his ministers, is that this defence investment plan, which the military and the man who was Defence Secretary until very recently, John Healey, have all said is inadequately funded, is going to be published apparently, before the NATO summit in a few days' time. I mean,
isn't that weird? If Andy Burnham says he doesn't buy into it, then it's finished already. But anyway, let's not go.
Well, there is a sort of argument which says it might be in Burnham's interest to let it be published so that contracts can be placed, but also signal that you will revisit whether the funding is adequate. Now, if I were Andy Burnham, I mean, some people around him are saying that's what he should do. Actually, if I was Andy Burnham, I think I would put enormous pressure on the Prime Minister not to publish it. I'll tell you why. It's because there are plenty of sensible people who just think the defence investment plan doesn't have its priorities right. I mean, there'll be plenty. There are certainly good reasons to say that the former junior defence minister Al Khan's is chancing his arm a bit by saying that he should be Prime Minister now, which he sort of signals. He's been an MP for about 3 minutes. And some would say that's a bit presumptuous, possibly. But when he talks about his concerns about the defence investment plan, that it's just putting money in the wrong places, as somebody who was in the military quite recently and definitely understands about defence, I would say people should listen to him. And if I were Andy Burnham, I would listen to him. And so, as I say, there are two issues about the defence investment plan for Andy Burnham. One is, is there enough money going in? Probably not. And is it being spent in the right way? But anyway, you were asking, though, I think, two other very important questions, which is how tough will he be on finding the money from sources other than tax rises or borrowing? Can he, make a statement to the markets as much as anybody else, and indeed to his own MPs, though they won't like it so much, about how he's prepared to make some really tough decisions to free up money for priorities? He has said that he does want to see the welfare bill, the growth in it, slow down. He said it publicly. What he didn't say is how he would do that. If I were Burnham, I might do two things. I might spend more on job creation, but simultaneously, I might be a bit more brutal with the way I reform it. I think if you did the combination, actually, you could have quite a benign effect. You might be able to keep Labour MPs on board. I mean, that's the thing he's most worried about, that there'll be another rebellion. But you definitely signal to lenders to the UK that they've slightly misjudged this person, and he is prepared to make difficult choices. And actually, the amount that we pay to borrow would fall. And once that happens, if it's sustainable, he at a stroke has more money to spend on other priorities, right? So, it is worth the risk of trying to get his party on board, because the sums of money are available if you can get that interest rate down, which we're currently paying more to borrow than any other comparable country, are huge. On the triple lock, again, if you could develop, you wouldn't abolish all protection for pensioners, but you might turn it from a triple lock to a double lock. Yeah. And double lock would save you a lot of money. And given that pensioners have done so much better than anybody else over the last 15 years in terms of their share of national income, the time is definitely right for some politician to be brave enough to go from triple to double.
To your point about, keeping the party on sides, we talked about this quite a long while ago, that when you win a massive majority, as Keir Starmer did, on the one hand, you say, well, you get things through Parliament, you can get difficult things through Parliament because you've got a massive majority. But actually, you also get very big rebellions, don't you? Because MPs are a bit giddy, they've got this massive majority, they're there because they want to do Labour things. So if you start wanting to do tough things like cut the welfare bill, you do get big rebellions. The one thing Andy Burnham's got in his favour is that I think there probably is something in the idea that Labour cannot change its leader again before the next election. So he has got a window in which he can say to the rest of the party, you got to like it or lump it, because you ain't getting rid of me, and this is what I insist on doing. But we'll see how that pans out. I just wanted to get finally onto.
But actually, before we just move on to the last thing, I'm struck that what nobody is. So obviously, the economics is difficult for him, and he will fail as a prime minister if he doesn't put together a credible growth plan. There's no question in my mind that that is the central task. But equally, when it comes to sustaining that coalition of the centre and left, which won him that enormous majority in Makerfield, there is another huge issue, which I'm slightly surprised nobody's talking about at the moment, which is Gaza. I'm talking to Labour MPs, not even those who are particularly on the left, they do believe that Burnham, if he really wants to hold his party together and, build that sort of coalition back of the so-called progressive coalition of left-wing voters, including, Greens and Lib Dems and all the rest of it, that he is going to have to take a tougher position on Israel than the current prime minister. I actually not sure what he'll do on that, and the signals so far are that he probably won't. But he is under enormous pressure to do that.
Let's move on to the last couple of things. So there's one thing that I just wanted to talk to you about, and I think it's worth mentioning some other ideas. People may have heard of Andy, Burnham's various ideas. So we talked a little bit earlier about electoral reform, potentially proportional representation. I think that has to be a long grass issue. He's either got to have a referendum, it seems to me, or he's going to have to put it in his manifesto. So I think that's a bit of a long grass issue. Council tax reform, he might announce it, but that's quite a bit of a long grass issue. These are things he can come to in time. And he does have ideas, to be fair, on quite bold ideas on a wide variety of subjects. There are various other things that might go into the can do quite quickly category. And one of them, obviously, is the utilities. Now, Thames Water is perhaps the most obvious one that is on the cusp of potentially, if he gets in, nationalisation or some kind of special administration. Now, DEFRA obviously said that renationalising the water companies would cost 90 billion. There are many other people who just simply don't believe that, and there are plenty of people who argue that, in fact, you could take over Thames Water and it wouldn't cost the Treasury anything because you'd give all the lenders a massive haircut as kind of punishment in a way for having overseen a company and the ripping out of enormous amounts of dividends and all the rest of it. But he's been pretty hot on this, and it's something that he's clearly quite committed to. Markets and lenders as well as anyone and how they operate. So I'm sort of interested to know what you think is the actual reality of nationalising Thames Water and potentially others, which is something he could and potentially might do in the first year of his premiership.
Well, he might not have any choice with Thames Water in the sense that it's in such dire straits. Yeah. And it may be that the price of a private sector rescue is so obviously too great that, as I say, it'll fall into public ownership by default. I think this is, to go back to where we started, the most important reason why he's got to have somebody at the Treasury as Chancellor who knows the Treasury inside out and is numerate and sophisticated, because it's a racing certainty that anything he wants to do in this territory will the Treasury will attempt to veto for reasons to do with how lenders to the UK will see it, and they'll argue that inevitably there'll be a massive negative reaction, and then secondly, they just take an ideological view on the whole that public ownership of these sorts of things led to very inefficient businesses. I think in some cases, some of the energy stuff improved as a result of privatization. Unquestionably, water has been a failure, and they should never have privatised water for the simple reason that when you privatise, your only hope of getting greater productivity and better customer service is if there is competition, and there was never going to be competition in water because it's a natural monopoly, and so it was always mad to privatise water, and it's been a disaster. And if they can find a way of taking the big water companies back into public ownership, they should, in my view. I think railways equally has been a failed privatisation. Much of that is now falling back into public ownership, and I think that's a good thing. But the question is basically, can you come up with a financial structure that doesn't scare the markets too much? But more importantly, it's less about the debt that's associated with it, and actually more about confidence that these businesses are going to be run efficiently, right? Because if you nationalize something, and in the end the investment doesn't go in, and in the end it's managed in a very inefficient way, it's just another reason. If you're an international lender, why you just think, why would I invest in the UK, where they're just throwing money into this black hole, and the economy's not growing, and I'm never going to get my money back. So it's all about, I don't think these things are actually should be made on an ideological basis. It's about, can you come up with structures that are better than the status quo? And it is very difficult, I think, to argue that the status quo in water is good working for the UK. No. I think in energy, I think he's got to be very careful, because I think he will struggle to come up with alternative structures, which, however annoyed we are that we pay higher bills for our gas and electricity than many other countries, that is not to do with, that's to do with energy policy actually pushed through by successive governments rather than the privatized nature. If successive governments had invested in nuclear 10, 15, 20 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. The reason we're in this mess is because successive governments did not wean us off gas.
Okay, so much to talk about. When we do actually get Prime Minister Burnham, including what he'll do about the EU and stuff, I'll leave that for another day. But for now, it's goodbye for me.
And it's goodbye for me.